With great pleasure that I introduce Anne's talk to you today, which is entitled Applied Linguistics, Language and Asylum Seekers, a linguistic ethnography of an asylum reception centre in France. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much. I have asked for it to be a bit darker so you can see the PowerPoint a bit better. And I am delighted to be here. I also feel very at home because everyone's sitting at the back, so I feel like I'm just talking to my first years. But I do understand it's better because then you can see some of the bottom. So thank you for making me feel less nervous. And I do want to have a few preliminaries before I start with that. And it is about risk. Okay, so yes, I took a risk, but I think the organizers took even more of a risk because when, indeed, it's been 2 years in the planning, when they contacted me, I was actually going to talk about the project that Claire mentioned, which is about multilingualism, language learning, and motivations in higher education. But then in September 2017, I heard that I was part, or that I could be part, of a project that was able to go into refugee centers. And I must say, I saw that as a unique opportunity to do something that brings together both activism, my engagement, but also hopefully draw upon some of my knowledges. It is interesting it's in France, because actually getting access to such centers in the UK or in the other country in which I've spent quite a lot of time, Australia, is sheer impossible. So I'm not sure whether the French are simply, friendlier in allowing academic researchers into refugee centers or have still a level of naivety that is no longer present, especially in Australia, where, as you know, detention centers or as they are called in Britain, by the way, removal centers. Before people arrive, they're already in removal centers. They're on islands and you can't actually access that. So the risk that they've taken with me is that they actually brought me on board for talking about multilingualism, and here I'm talking about refugees. I hope you're not going to be too disappointed. I do have to point out that we received the funding we heard about the funding in September 2017, and the work started in January 2018. So you actually have the very, very first insights in what is going to be a 2 or 3 year project. With that in mind, what I do is I present a lot of introductory information, but also much more issues around documentation, what it is that we are doing, what we're planning to do. So at this stage, as you can imagine, I'll just have a few reflections on what I think might happen later on. So with that in mind, I apologize if that's disappointing for you, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. Okay. Oops. Make sure I get... Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I know most of you in Europe actually know quite a bit about that, but just in case. The important thing is that it is in the press and actually in most public discourses seen as a crisis. So it is largely seen as refugee crisis in Europe. It is seen to be the largest sort of people movement since the Second World War. In effect, it is only a fraction of what the people movement after the Second World War, which was almost 10 million. Here we are talking about barely 3 million. The main source countries you've got there, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And as you also know from the press, the two major routes into Europe or the EU are via boat across the Mediterranean, and the other one is overland basically via Turkey, Albania, Hungary, possibly Bulgaria, and so on. And the fact of the two main forms of arrival do have an impact on the linguistic practices, but also linguistic challenges that the people actually have. Oh, why does it keep going? Okay. So a few more background things. So within, certainly being located at the moment in Britain, this kind of knowledge is probably fairly widespread. But what the two major agreements that actually govern what's happening with the refugee crisis is, on the one hand, the Schengen Agreement, which I think most of us know about when you travel to Europe. As Britain is not part of it, we still have to show passports. But so the Schengen Agreement is basically a free movement between most of the EU countries. The one that is very important and which is actually causing quite a lot of stress and pressure points is the so-called Dublin Agreement or Regulation of 2003, where it basically says that the EU state in which the asylum seeker arrives is responsible for the asylum application. As you know, again from the press, but possibly other areas, this is putting an enormous pressure on the sort of border regions in which the refugees arrive. What is being looked at by the EU at the moment is to what extent any of these agreements can be changed. I write challenged because the outcome might very well be that it's going to be stricter rather than a slight change in terms of making it easier for people to move, to have their asylum process started elsewhere. Okay. Again, very quickly, clearly, something that I don't have to tell you is what we're seeing on the political, social level is the atmosphere is moving more and more towards a rather negative focus on issues of people movement, of mobility, and especially also migration. I won't even go into Brexit, but the thing you do know in an increasing number of EU countries is that political parties in elections are actually on a platform of anti-migration. More recently, that's been seen in France, Germany, but also the Netherlands and very much Hungary. So in fact, often elections are actually with a focus on migration, on dealing with the refugee crisis. What of course also happens is that you then have inter-European fights and disagreements about who's going to process which refugee where, and to what extent people can try somewhere else. The other thing that will have been quite let's say, quite well described, described expansively in the media is the so-called dismantling of the Calais jungle. Okay, so these are some background things. In fact, despite the fact that it started in 2015, one has to say that certainly the EU has already started looking at the research in this area. To what extent have people started doing research in the area? So there's an overview of EU-funded research on the more recent migration situation. I must say, having read it, there's almost nothing on language. So the only things that I could find with respect to the more recent arrivals is a British Council document actually called Language for Resilience, which deals with Syrian refugees in Britain. The one that is probably of most interest to applied linguists is actually the action group Translators Without Borders, as you can see, more or less mirrored or sort of echoing the Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières. And here they actually are starting to look at issues around language in the refugee situation. Some of you, because you're working on applied linguistics, some of you will very much be aware of the so-called LADO test. In fact, quite a few of applied linguists have, well, basically critiqued the test. The LADO test is actually something that happens, for those of you who don't know it, is if a refugee has no documentation, papers or anything else, they have to submit to a language test to basically assess that they are that they are from the area they are claiming to be. It is fraught with difficulties. There is no understanding of multilingualism in particular areas. So if you come from country X, well, the national language is language Y, and if you come from a particular region, then you'll have that kind of accent. It basically works on that level. Unfortunately, it's here that I think we have not yet been very successful, despite really very detailed critiques of how problematic this test is. To date, nothing has changed. Actually, its use is increasing. It is being used quite regularly in Britain. It actually was written, it came out of Sweden, but it is spreading across Europe in terms of trying to assess the origin of a particular person. What does exist is a number, again partly by applied linguists, a number of quite interesting studies of discursive and narrative studies around news coverage dealing with refugees. But to date, there's been very little on what actually happens in refugee centers. There is one study, an MA thesis written, I think, for the University of Kansas on the Calais jungle. But furthermore, I would be happy to hear about other studies, but so far there's been very little. So let me introduce the project for you. So it is actually an acronym, but of course it's a quite suitable acronym, Liminal Project. It is a translation from the French. The research is being funded by the French National Research Agency for a period of 2 to 3 years. The funding is there for a whole 2 years, but we actually will probably get the 3rd year as well. So the idea is to go into 3 locations on the border regions of France with various pressure points. So one is Calais. It will not be the jungle, but there are actually semi-institutional or governmental or public reception centers, as the French call it, centres d'accueil, around Calais, so not anymore the Calais jungle, but around there. Then you have the border with Italy, because Italy is, of course, a major country receiving migrants and refugees, so in the Ventimiglia area. And then the 3rd one is actually Paris, increasingly in the past because people would fly into Paris, increasingly now because they've come from somewhere else. The main foci of our research, which is a multidisciplinary team, is, as I say, the linguistic and cultural practices, interactions, the mediations, the negotiations between the various players in the first stages, or the first official or public stages of the migration or asylum process. Okay. What is going to come out of it, less so in terms of purely applied linguistic work, but actually of the entire project, is that there will be resources for the various participants in trying to assist with this process. So there will be, in fact, language guides and multilingual guides, so language guides potentially for refugees about what actually happens. If you know, and I'm sure this is the same in Britain, is if you want to find out about the asylum process in France, you can go to various websites. The French, it's only in French, it does not exist in any other language, and it's basically legal bureaucratic French. So it's, I would say, primarily oriented towards lawyers rather than to an actual refugee applicant. The main thing is because we're working with an institution, the National Institution for Languages in Paris, which in French is the INALCO one, and they actually train, I think they still teach about 70, 75 different languages, and they actually train people in interpreting, translating in a lot of African, Asian, and Eastern European languages. So for them it is about creating a database. So the languages, the priority languages that have been identified is because of the source countries, and to some extent most of these have a level of being lingua francas in those areas, so that we can focus on those mainly. Okay. Okay. So, in terms of, I must say, there are only 2 linguists working in the project. I work with a colleague from the French institution who is a sociolinguist but specializing in Urdu. So we work together on the sociolinguistic and the applied linguistic side. What we will be exploring will be, on the one hand, in fact, the linguistic repertoires or languages that the refugees have or come with before they engage in the journey or in the actual migration or refugee process. So what kind of linguistic elements, what kind of languages, varieties do they have before they started it? Then we also will look very much at what they accumulate during their journey. Now, as you can see, this might be very different for those who actually fly in from Syria. I must say there are very few doing that now. The first wave might still have done that. Now, a lot of them are coming overland, even if the last leg is actually via the sea. The ones I've talked to so far have often had an 18-month journey overland from Afghanistan over Turkey, spend time in various legal and illegal migration camps, and actually accumulating at least fractions of various languages. What I will do today is to talk a bit more about the languages in these centres d'accueil. So the interactions between the refugees, volunteers, and the officials. The square quotes for officials is that they are in fact not public servants of France, but they're working for the charity that runs the centre, but have a more official function. I'll be looking at the main communicative events, and what I will spend most of the time on is giving you a linguistic landscape of one centre. We'll also be looking at the language services they provide for the students, and then what will be very critical, but that's outside of the reception centre, is to look at the linguistic interaction when they actually apply for asylum, when they go to usually the council or a community area where they go through the formal interview. Of course, one of the other things we'll be looking at is then both looking at the policies that exist around the linguistic rights of refugees, and then the actual practices in the various stages of the asylum process. Okay. Very quickly over the methodology, you can imagine that this is largely an ethnographic study because we are only going into a number of refugee areas or centers as such. So there will be extensive participant observation. We will undertake as much as possible interviews with different actors or participants in the process, refugees and volunteers. Both of these groups are actually quite easy. So are the interpreters. Officials are much more difficult to agree to be interviewed. We're also collecting, in effect, what I would call diaries or narratives. The more literate ones actually keep Facebook accounts and will write something on there. So we're trying to see to what extent we can follow up on some of that. As I said, what I mainly will present today is a linguistics landscape data of one centre. And of course, we'll also be doing desktop research on the policies around this. Okay. So what we've done so far is we've had 3 fieldwork sessions in one center in Paris, and it's called Porte de la Chapelle because it's very close to one of the major entries into Paris. And it's been done between January 2018 and March 2018. I've personally collected linguistic biographies of 3 refugees, and we've also had interviews with 3 volunteers at the moment. I won't, however, go into detail about them. We've done then a linguistic landscape of the center, and I will also present a little bit on online practices and the social media in connection with the refugees in these centers. So I basically repeat here. I am going to spend a little bit of time to give you the background of what it looks like, where it is, and how it actually functions before I actually can give you some of the more linguistic data. Okay. So it doesn't look like much, but this isn't the this is a Paris you probably haven't seen that much before. It's on the outskirts. It's towards the what is called seen as the troubled suburb of Saint-Denis, but you can see in the picture sort of a white-yellow bubble, and if you can, you will probably see something that looks like a well, it's a former, I think, railway yard. That is currently the refugee center. I will use the word bulle, so the white-yellow bit on the picture is called a bubble in French. It actually is a bubble, not as nice as the one you're going to have dinner in, but so it's called La Bulle, and that is where the receptions, and this is where the more formal things happen, and the refugees are housed in the former railway yards. Again, this is the kind of thing you will see around there, people queuing for tea and coffee, or waiting, as you will see, to actually potentially get into the center. This is what it normally looks like. In fact, one of the things that happens is most of the people will already have lived for weeks, if not months, on the streets around the Bulle. They are regularly cleaned up by the police, and I think 3 or 4 days later they start again. But so you basically see that they live in makeshift tents and so on under the bridge, which is very close to the actual center. Here you see again volunteers working there outside, because in fact for the center can house up to 400 men. I'll say a bit more about that, men. But there are literally thousands of men, usually men rather than family, living on the streets until they actually can get in there. And they're basically fed by various volunteers, including British ones. So here you have a slightly better picture of it. So you see La Bulle in the front, the bubble. I think I'll try. You can see this container here. This is where they arrive, and where, in fact, I'll come back to that, where a very crucial key interaction occurs. They will then be processed here, and then for a period of up to 10 days, they can stay in the railway yard. Okay, so basically, what the railway yard is it contains now a range of containers in which the men live. The men are single men and men, younger men, men over the age of 18 who have come with their families are, however, separated from their families. So single men and men over the age of 18 will actually go into the center. Women and children are housed somewhere else. At the moment, we had to focus on this one because it closed down in March, so we had to run against time to race against the time because of its closure. So that's basically, the men basically live up to 10 days in these containers. You'll see this is another container, so there'll be one for washing and other facilities, and that's what it looks like. They step up and then they step into the container. Usually there are 8 to 10 beds in a container, extremely cramped, but we were there in January and March and it was a very cold one this year, and so they at least have some heating in the thing. Okay, some key facts about the center. So it opened in 2015 as a result of major protests by various charities that, you know, people were just living on the streets and nothing was done. Unfortunately, it closed in March 2018, and now this is actually quite, well, how can I say, weird for people working in humanities. The railway yard is going to house a new faculty of humanities of one of the Paris universities. So you can understand that quite a few of us were feeling quite embarrassed working there. It's run by a Maoist voluntary organization. It is, however, done on behalf of the city of Paris and the French state. So they are actually acting as agents. But so the relationship is not 100% clear to what extent they're advocates of what the state is wanting to see, or to what extent they really act as charities. That is very problematic. They actually have basically 3 roles, that is to select and identify the people. I'll come back to that, that can progress to the asylum process. They provide temporary accommodation up to 10 days, and about 400 people can fit in there, and they should give some general information about life in France and also about the asylum process. Okay, so what I'll briefly go through is we try to identify in these centers, because there will be quite a lot of them around France, is where does the key encounter occur, who takes part, what is the focus of the interaction, what languages are being used, and to what extent is there actually language assistance. So I'm going to give you a few of those before describing the linguistic landscape. Now, this is the most crucial one, and this is the one we can almost get no real information on. So you can see it queuing. So on Monday morning, on Saturday and Sunday, there is no, you cannot go and queue in order to actually be processed. But between Monday and Friday, you can. Then there are often, even in winter when it was ice cold, probably by 7 o'clock in the morning, there's a queue of over 1,000 people waiting to go to what I showed you, this tiny little container, where there is a volunteer who speaks French, who potentially speaks some English, and sometimes is assisted by an Arabic interpreter, going through questions, asking the person the name and documents, and whether or not they've got any referrals. Now, I must say, we cannot work out, and this is quite a large team, who gets admitted and who doesn't. So I don't know whether we'll ever be able to do that, but it's a mystery to all of the people working there why this person gets admitted and not the other. We can't actually see it. This is also the communicative encounter where we had least opportunity to observe things, because that was also seen to be the most secretive. But so if for some reason or other you do get a nod, then you actually get, like in a bakery or something, a ticket to wait, and then you can come back within 24 or 48 hours to be processed. Then the gates to the BAAL open and you actually are going to be assessed. So unfortunately, I have very little information about the first communicative encounter because of its secrecy. So when they do go in, and it's usually on an individual or 2 or 3 people at the same time, they go into the bubble, and the bubble does have a number of containers which are used as studios for an informal pre-interview. I'll come back to that later. But so the person who brings people in are volunteers. Most of them are actually former refugees, often children or children of refugees of the Second World War. They seldom share the same language, but they have a willingness to try and make themselves understood and to actually try and welcome them. All of that is usually done completely in French, but occasionally with some English words or Arabic words in there. They do welcome them. This is one of the very few times that they actually get a social interaction. They provide very basic information about the center, and they will also ask if they will need interpreter or translator information, assistance later on. However, these interactions hardly ever last more than 5 or 10 minutes. Then the main function in terms of communicative encounters is actually the pre-assessment interview. Now, this is quite a complex one because it is undertaken by actually an Emmaus official, which means is this person is salaried. He or she works on behalf of the charity, but is in fact a form of representative of the city of Paris and the state. So tries to give the refugee a feeling of what they're going to expect in the formal interview. The interview is completely done in French, but often they will have an interpreter present in the 5 languages that we've identified. They will ask in a quite brutal way questions about origins and reasons for asylum, again to give them a feeling of what actually can happen. They do then become slightly friendlier and outline the stages of the application process, completely in French, completely with brochures that are completely in French. There's nothing in any other language there. That process takes about 20 minutes. Can I say, I think, overall speaking, you hear very little speech from the actual refugee. So that's 90% speaking on behalf of the Emmaus representative. Other communicative encounters that we have noted and that we are working on is interactions between the canteen staff and the refugees. This is one of the only, they have 2 social spaces, the canteen and in fact then sort of a small social space. The other one is where there are official interactions. Once a week, a doctor will come and also some legal representatives. So there will be minimal interaction between a refugee and an official or a volunteer about organizing that. Interactions between refugees I will actually briefly talk about, and then what is quite important is the online interactions that occur. Okay, so let me just move over to the linguistic landscape. Basically, again, most of you are probably much more familiar and worked more with linguistic landscape than I have, so I feel like a bit of an intruder here, because of course linguistic landscape until very recently was about public spaces, and in lots of ways this is not a public space, it's a quite closed space. But I do think it's important to actually try and see what's happening in these centers, also in terms of signage and symbols, to understand a bit what the linguistic environment is in which they operate. So the main thing is that what we looked at is what kind of signs are provided, the linguistic elements of these signs, and what is the purpose of these signs. So I'm going to give you a few examples of these. And I don't subscribe purely to a quantitative method, but I do point out that we were under quite a lot of time pressure because the center was only basically, from when we started, open for 3 months, and you can't sort of go in every day, especially also living in England, it wasn't that easy to go that often. So can I just, so in effect, what I noticed was a total of 103 signs in both the, what is called la halle, which is the train yard where they sleep, they're sleeping and living quarters, and then la bulle, the bubble, where the more formal aspects occur. You'll see a bit later is that the living quarters were divided into various sectors, and it's like green and yellow and red and so on. So actually, in fact, there are only 20 signs that occur in 4 different areas. So what I'm pointing out is that, you know, of the 87, 20 are unique ones, and then they are repeated 4 times. So the kinds of signs you see are mainly directive and informative. Directive are things like signs to washing areas, canteens, social areas. Informative, menus, meal times, cleaning, instructions. And then there are some in sleeping quarters, instructions regarding the heating. Do never put anything on the heater. So when you walk into the container, the only thing you see is clothes drying on the heater. Cleaning instructions, lights, noise, drying, and so on. And then there were 3 relating to washing and cleaning facilities. There were 7 general signs at the beginning of the living quarters. That is allocation of rooms, and I'll show you that in a minute. Pick up points for interviews. Now, I won't show that. It's an actually very interesting sign, but it has the people's individuals' names, so I didn't feel that it was ethical to show that. And I can't, I can't actually cross them out, because then the sign doesn't make any sense anymore. But also general signs about visits of doctors, lawyers, and so on, and events that in fact have occasionally a theatre performance and so on, and transport, how to actually get from the center to the more formal interaction. Okay, so let's have a look. In the bubble, or in the bulle, we have 16 signs. They're mainly directive and informative. They're about life in France, life in the center, and information about the asylum process. And only 2 signs in this entire area are actually about welcoming people to France. Okay, so let me show you a few of these. Okay, now this one is completely in French, but it does have a pictogram. Now, this is about, this was for the summer. This actually says that you should keep drinking when it's hot, okay? So I asked about 15 of the refugees what it is that they thought it was, okay? I know you can't see it in detail. They all thought it was something that you had to do, that if the fire started, that you had to put water on it. I think 2 worked out that it was a bottle, and that actually would take a long time to extinguish a fire with a little water bottle. So what we're getting here is an attempt at a pictogram, but the way in which it's being used, and most of the important information about what it is that you do with this bottle is completely in French, so they actually don't know how to use it. Okay, this one, here you see more of the multilingual signs, and I'll show you the level, or the actual font does make, it has a meaning here. So you'll get it very much in French first, horaire, repas, and then you might have English, and as you can see at the bottom, for the people who write it, dîner and dinner are the same, so they don't bother putting dinner anymore, okay? And then, as you can see, in minute little script, you have Arabic script. Sometimes it is actually correct. Often it isn't, because it's Google Translate. So you can actually see that there is, on the one hand, a willingness to do something, but on the other hand, it doesn't really help. I should also say that the first people who came through in 2015 often were quite literate and could understand some of this. The people who are coming through now, their literacy levels are actually relatively low. Okay. Or here you have then les tasses doivent rester dans le restaurant. And then you'll see the issues about also into other languages. Okay. All right. So this is what I say. Show you. They have to work out where they sleep. Okay. So you have here, I suppose, a very nice example of translanguaging or code switching. So room 1, bleu pâle, and so on. So again, this is how they're getting information about where they've actually got to go. I must say I got completely lost myself, and I do think I can understand those languages. So you can see this is helping. Okay, now these are the ones that you see in the bulle, the bubble, about how life in France. So you have this entire area. I only have a thing. Où se laver, but there is, you can see a shower pictogram there. But then you've got all of these things. Again, when we asked the refugees there what that meant, and they have no idea what that means, okay? So that's où se laver, where to wash oneself. Où me faire soigner, so if you've got to go to hospital. And then the best one is qui peut m'aider, and then all of these things are in French, and there's absolutely nothing in either English or in any of the other languages. But it is seen as helping the refugees, migrants, in learning to accommodate to life in France. Okay, so the final signs I want to show is these are the only ones about welcome. So it is actually a very small sign, so I've magnified it, that it says there, bienvenue aux personnes migrantes. The English one is then to migrants, persons, and then you've got it in Arabic. Okay, so that's the only two signs you have and how to move about. These two here are quite interesting ones. In effect, children can come and visit their brothers, because their fathers usually, their fathers as well, or brothers, on Sunday, and so they can actually leave some pictures in that area. Okay, so that's the first impression. So how do I summarize this briefly? Okay, so official practical information is completely in French or with a pictogram, basically. Trilingual signs do occur in the 3 major languages. I've tried to identify French is actually really very large, English is somewhat smaller, and Arabic is actually minute. Sometimes linguistic signs are aided by pictograms, but the pictograms don't really work that well. And there are some pictograms without any languages, but that is they're fairly simple, and there's only 1 or 2 of them. Okay, let me just go through a couple of other things with you. Okay, so I do want to point out about the linguistic practices in the center. This is more the communicative encounters between the refugees themselves and also between the refugees and the various volunteers or so on, okay? Unfortunately, we were not allowed to audio record, okay? So it does require quite intensive note writing. I've spent a total of 24 hours over 3 visits in this area, but quite a few of my colleagues have spent much more time. One of the things we note, because they only spend about 10 days, is the number and type of languages that changed between January and March were quite different. More and more are you finding people of very small language groups, of very small varieties, because the ones who were able to come in 2015 often were able to come by plane, have more money, and we're now moving towards groups that are less able to afford a variety of things. It's certainly true that those who came overland have far more what I would call either fragmented, or if you want to say it slightly negative, fractured, or using Blomart's term, truncated multilingual repertoires. They actually managed to say quite a bit in different languages. Okay. What is very important in this particular area is that the volunteer staff, I've already said, are often former refugees or children thereof, and they are very willing to learn a little bit of the language to make the people feel welcome. Especially, I must say, the female canteen staff. They go out of their way to try and greet the refugees in a few of their languages. Okay. Now, an important thing is that we talk about linguistic landscape. Of course, linguistics is also about sound, or is a lot about sound, okay? So one of the things that I try to do is to note, because I wasn't allowed to record, an audioscape of what do you hear? I mean, there are people there with masses of different languages. What is it that you hear? Now, this is a slightly surprising one. Okay, so let me just go through that. Okay, so there are two types of social spaces, recreational space and then the canteen. Yet, together with my colleagues, I probably spend on each of the visits about 4 or 5 hours around those areas. One of the things that we absolutely mark is it is by relatively silence. So what you have is you have a TV playing in the background, but quite not very loud, French channel, usually news or something like that. You then have very subdued various languages, and I'll come back to the final thing, is people speaking in various languages on the mobile phone. So one of the things that is very important in these groups is, and what is very different from former refugee areas, is that their main interaction is actually on a mobile phone talking to their families in the country from which they've come. So you hear very subdued a whole range of languages, but it's an interaction with a mobile phone. At meal times, you occasionally do hear some French and English, sometimes Arabic, but it's largely the canteen staff who talk. And in fact, what I must say is that because quite a few of the people do have one of the languages, they share a language, or one of the vehicular languages, they don't often speak to each other. So this is the typical view. I'm sure you probably can't see it, but both of them, the typical view is that it's a fair large area and there were quite a number of that. So he's talking on the phone and he is actually looking at his phone. So over 3 visits, spending 4 hours, this is the main communicative view or interaction that we get of these men in these contexts. So on the final issue then is that the residents are given when they arrive a SIM card, and they basically undertake this kind of activity. It does indicate whether they are literate in a language or not. But most of what they do is actually visual information or oral. So they will talk, have video chats with their families, but they do access Facebook. They do watch and read news from home, usually watch it. One thing they will all watch in French is football, because obviously they know quite a bit about football, so they don't need to hear the commentary. What is interesting is a number of them do try to find informal blogs and websites to assist them with the asylum process. Okay. Verbal interactions, as I've indicated, is that there's absolutely minimal interactions between the refugees. I'm not sure how to interpret that at the moment. I do understand they have just often come from, let's say, from the street into an environment that is relatively safe for a period of 10 days. So there's a feeling of relief, but at the same time of anxiety, whether or not they're possibly going to get through the process. So that may actually be one of the reasons, but we really need to look at that. However, there is very, very little social interaction, even if they share the same language. Okay. The staff interaction with staff at the moment, we can't really observe any kind of patterns, except for individual canteen staff, especially wanting to assist them with that. Okay. So, in the final slide is basically what are our first initial observations. I suppose it is a little bit but I know, I won't take it back. I actually think what we're starting to see is that that linguistic environment and the landscape data already introduce the refugees, the residents of these centres d'accueil, to the language regimes that they will be exposed to in France. I do want to keep, or we want to keep an open mind, but I do think you were starting to see that more and more. The interesting thing will be to what extent the female camps or the family camps are slightly different. What you also have is the reluctant recognition or admission of English as a global lingua franca, because you do find that where possible, they'll have some sort of introduction of English. However, increasingly, the people who come through do not have access to English. So having English there is not really in any way helping. There are some attempts at providing information in Arabic, but the other major languages, Dari, Pashto, and Amharic, you see absolutely no signage. Amongst the officials, there is still a feeling that people have literacy in their home language, and so assume that what they need to provide is information, written information in their home language. Okay. I think the main point that comes as a surprise to us is the impact of e-communication and media on the communicative behavior of these residents. And I do think that will have an impact on how we can potentially provide assistance, if that's one of the things we'll do, in terms of giving information to the refugees. So my final slide is about applied linguistics in refugee settings. Is it a risky business? I actually draw upon work that I've done in another context more than particularly here, is if you, as an applied linguist, do you take a position? Are you taking a position in favor? So are you an advocate? Are you seen as an advocate for the refugees? Or are you automatically seen as acting on behalf of the authorities? Because these are the questions we regularly got, both from the refugees and also from the volunteers or semi-officials, in that what is, whose side are you on? So that is something that I know applied linguists have to learn to deal with, okay? But also we should ask who is actually assisted by insights into language. Because that's not so clear, straightforward. Are we really working on both sides, or is it something that we prefer to do with one side or another? And the third question that has come up is really where, in fact, do applied linguists sit in the hierarchy of disciplines? I think it's very important to dwell a little bit on that, because what we found, I mean, here I'm working in a team that has anthropologists, economists, a psychotherapist, a psychologist, interpreters and translators. And when we started, applied linguists, or we were sociolinguists, were absolutely at the bottom of them. It was questioned why we would actually look at these kinds of things. They accepted us into it because we could help interpreters and translators. For them, it was about interpreting and translating. That was a language issue. Fortunately, one of the things that we can see here is by us working in a multidisciplinary team, they're starting to see that some of the evidence that we bring forward can actually feed in quite well. The main thing, however, is that if the sociolinguist presents it to the official, he or she will be not heard. If it works through the economist and actually through the psychotherapist, by the way, and the psychologist, the information is heard. So one of the things that I think I put forward in terms of, risky business, what business are we in, is to what extent do we reflect on for whom are our insights? Secondly, how are we perceived working in these quite complex situations. And thirdly, our own position as applied linguists vis-à-vis our colleagues in other disciplines. How do they react to it? Thank you for putting up with me, because I'm between you and your dinner. Okay. Excuse me, can I just show you the thing? Because I thought we would have questions or comments, but we won't have that. This actually is not a sign from the center. This is a Calais sign, okay? Importantly, for those of you who ever want to work on that, is one of the interesting things that refugees will do is, when it is the language of protest, they will use French or English. They will not use any of their own languages.
Thank you very much, Anne, for that very thought-provoking and sobering discussion. We have a small gift for you from the local organising committee to say thank you very much.